The documents were never meant to surface. For over 2 centuries, Virginia's courts buried them beneath layers of silence, locked in the basement of a Richmond courthouse where light couldn't reach. Yet what they reveal is not just scandal. It is a blueprint. In the winter of 1789, whispers began spreading through the tobacco-rich hills of Henrico County. Rumors of a man so consumed by his bloodline, his legacy, his absolute dominion, that morality itself became irrelevant. His name was Jonathan Caldwell. To his neighbors, he was a model of piety, a towering widower, wealthy beyond reason, a man who quoted scripture as easily as he manipulated markets. But inside Millhaven Estate, behind locked doors and carefully staged smiles, Jonathan was rewriting the very definition of family. And then came Elizabeth Hartwell, 10 years old, orphaned by a carriage accident on a storm-drenched night. She should have been a tragedy. Instead, she became a weapon. Because Jonathan Caldwell didn't just raise her, he designed her. These sealed records, unearthed by accident in 1892, describe in haunting detail the rituals, the lies, the conditioning, and the contract that bound them. It is more than forbidden history. It is a glimpse into the machinery of control, where love, power, and blood became indistinguishable, and once you hear this, you cannot unknow it. Elizabeth's arrival at Millhaven wasn't fate. It was calculation disguised as compassion. Jonathan Caldwell was a man haunted by his grandfather's final command. A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed. See that the Caldwell name and the Caldwell lands remain forever united, no matter what sacrifices this unity may require. When Samuel Bigham, Jonathan's overseer, delivered news of the Hartwell carriage accident, Jonathan's mind didn't drift toward charity, it drifted toward strategy. Within hours, he ordered Elizabeth, bathed, clothed, and silenced. The surviving records describe his reaction when he first saw her. The resemblance to his late wife, Catherine Harrison, was staggering. The same sharp jawline, the same winter-dark eyes, the same subtle, aristocratic grace. It wasn't just likeness, it was continuity. By the next morning, letters that should have gone to distant Hartwell relatives were never sent. Elizabeth's supposed Uncle Thomas, the guardian she believed would come for her, had been fictionally killed off by Jonathan's forged documents. In a matter of weeks, Jonathan stood before the county clerk, presenting himself as Elizabeth's benevolent protector. The signatures were flawless. From that moment forward, Elizabeth Hartwell ceased to exist. In the eyes of Virginia's law, she became Elizabeth Caldwell, Jonathan's adopted daughter. But adoption was never Jonathan's endgame. It was only the first mechanism of control. From the outside, Jonathan Caldwell seemed the picture of paternal devotion. He hired the best tutors from Richmond, filled Millhaven's library with imported volumes, and boasted that Elizabeth would be the most educated young lady in Henrico County. But education wasn't his goal. Conditioning was. The sealed court records describe lessons designed not just to instruct, but to reshape Elizabeth's mind from the inside out. Miss Adelaide Fenwick, her primary tutor, taught literature, arithmetic, and French, but Jonathan personally oversaw the rest. He chose the Bible passages she memorized, emphasizing stories of patriarchs who bent morality to serve divine purpose. Abraham taking his half-sister as wife, Lot's daughters ensuring the continuation of their bloodline. To a child raised in isolation, these were not tales of sin, they were precedents. Jonathan spoke constantly of blood, of family, of sacred unity that stood above society's fragile norms. To Elizabeth, loyalty became indistinguishable from obedience. By 14, she no longer thought of herself as an orphan rescued by a guardian. She thought of herself as chosen, part of a destiny greater than laws or church decrees. And Jonathan reinforced it at every turn. He restricted her correspondence. Visitors were controlled, conversations overheard, and questions deflected. To neighbors, Jonathan was preparing his daughter for a powerful marriage that would merge fortunes. But beneath the facade, another document lay waiting, locked in a Richmond lawyer's desk drawer. A marriage contract, already signed. In the winter of 1778, Jonathan Caldwell traveled to Richmond under the guise of estate business, but the ledgers he carried concealed something far more dangerous, a plan so intricate it blurred the lines between morality, law, and ownership. Inside the mahogany-lined office of Cornelius Vance, a DI, street attorney favored by Virginia's elite, Jonathan executed the first step. He formally adopted Elizabeth, cementing her legal identity as his daughter, but while that document became part of the public record, another never saw daylight. Vance drafted a marriage contract, vague, open-ended, and terrifying in its foresight. It stipulated Jonathan Caldwell's intent to wed a young woman of suitable breeding and education, to be determined at a future date. No name, no timeline, no witnesses. It was designed to wait in silence until Elizabeth reached maturity. In an era obsessed with bloodlines, wealth, and consolidation, the law didn't question him. The contract wasn't illegal, it was invisible. And Jonathan understood something most men of his time didn't. Control isn't enforced, it's engineered. By shaping Elizabeth's world, he was shaping her identity. Her tutors, her books, her faith, her isolation, all threads in a web designed to erase her sense of self and replace it with his vision. Mill Haven became more than a plantation, it became a laboratory. And Elizabeth, she became the experiment. By 1783, Elizabeth was 17, and unrecognizable from the orphan who'd arrived at Mill Haven 7 years earlier. Jonathan's conditioning had worked. Her tutors marveled at her discipline, her grace, her sharp intelligence. To the outside world, she was the image of refinement, destined for an advantageous marriage that would merge fortunes and secure the Caldwell legacy. But inside Mill Haven's locked doors, something else was unfolding. The court documents describe fragments of Elizabeth's private writings, smuggled into evidence decades later. She wrote of dreams she didn't understand, of a strange weight pressing on her chest at night, of feeling like she was living a story written by someone else's hand. Jonathan fed these thoughts carefully, like a patient gardener pruning a rare plant. He told her she was set apart, chosen to fulfill a destiny the world wouldn't understand. He whispered scripture twisted into justification, the patriarchs who kept their blood pure, the ancient laws that superseded man's. Elizabeth began to believe him. She stopped asking about relatives. She stopped questioning her isolation, and when Jonathan spoke of sacrifice for the preservation of family, she nodded, not because she understood, but because she'd been taught obedience disguised as loyalty. By her 18th birthday, the invisible marriage contract waited, ready to be activated, and so did Jonathan. The winter of 1784 came early, blanketing Henrico County in silence. Mill Haven's windows glowed against the frost, but inside the great house, warmth carried a different meaning. Elizabeth had turned 18. Her tutors were dismissed one by one, their services no longer necessary. Letters from distant acquaintances mysteriously stopped arriving. Invitations to Richmond balls were politely declined on her behalf. The walls closed in without her noticing. Until, ill, there was nowhere left to go. Then Jonathan made his move. On the evening of December the 12th, he summoned Elizabeth to his study. The fire snapped in the hearth, shadows licking the walnut-paneled walls. On the desk lay a folded parchment sealed in dark red wax, the document Cornelius Vance had drafted years earlier. Jonathan didn't ask, he declared, "Elizabeth, from this day forward, you are no longer simply my ward. You are my covenant, my blood, my future." She protested, of course, at least at first, but Jonathan had anticipated resistance. He spoke of scripture, destiny, and duty, weaving fear and reverence together until her objections dissolved beneath the weight of his authority. That night, the marriage contract was activated. Elizabeth Hartwell, the orphaned girl, no longer existed. Elizabeth Caldwell, both daughter and wife, was born. After December 12, 1784, reality itself began to fracture inside Millhaven. Elizabeth didn't wake the next morning as a bride. She woke as a different person entirely, because Jonathan made sure of it. Every trace of her former life was erased. Her childhood journals, her parents' belongings, even the locket she once clutched at night, gone. In their place, Jonathan constructed a new narrative. He told her that destiny had always pointed here, that she was born for this role, that questioning it meant betraying the divine order. He isolated her completely. Visitors were turned away at the gates. Letters to distant relatives were intercepted and burned. Even the household servants were instructed to address her differently, to refer to her not as Miss Elizabeth, but as Mistress Caldwell. Over time, resistance became impossible, not because she accepted him, but because Jonathan reprogrammed her sense of self. He blurred boundaries until she no longer knew where daughter ended and wife began. Court transcripts, unsealed more than a century later, revealed fragments of her testimony. She spoke softly, almost mechanically. He said, "God chose us to restore the purity of blood." He said the world outside these gates was corrupted. Jonathan didn't just control her body, he colonized her mind. By 1787, the Forbidden Covenant was complete, but Jonathan's ambition didn't stop there, because one Caldwell heir wasn't enough. By 1787, Millhaven was silent, but beneath that silence, a dynasty was being engineered. Jonathan Caldwell wasn't satisfied with merely possessing Elizabeth. To him, their union wasn't about love, it was about continuity. He believed the Caldwell line was chosen, divinely set apart, and that outsiders diluted destiny. The only way to preserve purity was through control of blood itself. The unsealed documents revealed Jonathan's handwritten journals, each page meticulously describing plans that extended generations ahead. He wrote of Caldwell heirs as instruments, not children, designed to consolidate land, power, and influence into a single, undivided empire. Elizabeth's role became clearer with every entry. Through her, the line restores itself. Through her, the covenant remains unbroken. By 1788, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. To the outside world, she was Jonathan's adopted daughter, and the child's existence was carefully disguised. Parish records listed her only as a distant ward, while whispers of scandal were silenced with generous donations to the local clergy. But within Millhaven, Jonathan declared the infant the true heir, the embodiment of both Caldwell bloodlines converging back into one. It wasn't a family anymore. It was a closed system. And yet, hidden within her private writings, Elizabeth left signs of awakening. Scribbled words smuggled beneath loose floorboards, fragments historians later uncovered. "I am two women living in one body, one who obeys, one who remembers." By 1790, Elizabeth Caldwell was 24, and on the surface the perfect embodiment of Jonathan's design. But inside, she was splintering. Her son Thomas was nearly 2. Whenever she looked into his pale green eyes, she saw not Jonathan, but herself, and something inside her woke up. She began keeping secrets, tiny, dangerous ones, hiding scraps of parchment beneath the nursery floorboards, stitching coded words into the hems of her dresses, whispering lullabies to Thomas that Jonathan had forbidden. It wasn't rebellion yet, not openly, but it was the beginning of remembering. Jonathan sensed it. He grew more possessive, more watchful. Every conversation was monitored. Servants were rotated constantly to prevent outside influence. Even the church where Elizabeth once found solace was taken from her. Jonathan forbade her from attending services unless he was present. And yet, The cracks widened. Historians later uncovered fragments of a hidden diary she kept during these years. One chilling line repeats 3 times on a single torn page. He says God chose us. But why does God feel silent? The walls of Millhaven whispered at night, her own voice echoing back at her. But the deeper she remembered who she was, the more dangerous Jonathan became. Because Jonathan Caldwell had no intention of letting Elizabeth go. By 1791, Elizabeth made her first, desperate attempt to reach beyond Millhaven's walls. Under the cover of night, she wrote a letter, her handwriting shaky, hurried, smudged by candlelight. It was addressed to her late mother's cousin in Williamsburg, one of the last living relatives Jonathan hadn't severed ties with. She hid the letter inside a servant's basket of linens, praying it would slip past Jonathan's endless surveillance. It never arrived. Weeks later, Elizabeth was summoned to Jonathan's study. On his desk lay the unopened envelope. The red wax seal was broken. "There are no secrets here," he said calmly. "Not between us, not anymore." That night, 3 servants were dismissed without explanation. One disappeared entirely. Elizabeth began to understand. Jonathan's control wasn't confined to Millhaven. His influence seeped into the parish, the courts, even the postal riders who traveled the dirt roads of Henrico County. Every door she thought she could open had been locked before she reached it. Then came the ledger. In a hidden compartment of Jonathan's desk, she found a thick, leather-bound book filled with names. Dozens of families across Virginia, judges, merchants, clergy, all connected to Jonathan through debts, land transfers, and quiet agreements. Elizabeth realized, with a sinking terror, that she wasn't trapped in a house. She was trapped in a network, and Jonathan Caldwell wasn't just her captor. He was building an empire. By 1793, Elizabeth understood the truth too late. Jonathan's obsession was never just about her, it was about Thomas. She discovered it one winter night, hidden deep within the cellar archives of Millhaven. Behind a false wall, inside a chest sealed with iron clasps, she found a collection of documents Jonathan had never meant for her to see. Birth records, land deeds, handwritten contracts signed by men of power, men who served in the Virginia Assembly, men in robes of the clergy, men whose names would one day be etched into history books. And then, tucked between the pages, a single parchment scrawled in Jonathan's unmistakable hand. Thomas is the vessel. Through him, the covenant completes. No Caldwell blood must ever leave the circle. The words crushed the air from her lungs. Jonathan didn't just intend to control Thomas's future. He meant to marry him into the line again, perpetuating the purity he worshipped. Elizabeth saw it clearly now. She wasn't the last victim. She was the first link in a chain that could stretch generations. That night she clutched her son close and whispered into his hair, "I will get you out. I swear it." But Jonathan Caldwell was already watching, always watching, and before she could act, he moved first. The winter of 1794 turned Millhaven into a fortress. Jonathan Caldwell's paranoia had grown into something monstrous. The gates were chained, windows sealed, servants forbidden to speak unless spoken to. He moved through the halls at night carrying a lantern, its dim light carving shadows across the walls as though hunting ghosts only he could see. Elizabeth felt them too, the weight of unseen eyes, the constant sense that every word she breathed was being recorded somewhere. But worse than Jonathan's madness was his certainty. One night, Elizabeth overheard him in the library, whispering to the family portrait of his late father, "The blood must be guarded. I am chosen. I am the hand." She fled before he saw her, clutching Thomas tight. Then came the screams. A young servant girl, no more than 16, was found hanging in the east wing. Jonathan declared it suicide, but Elizabeth knew better. She'd seen the bruises on the girl's wrists, the terror in her eyes days before. It became clear. Anyone who knew too much simply disappeared. Elizabeth realized her window was closing. If she didn't escape soon, Thomas would never leave Millhaven alive. She began hiding small parcels of food beneath the nursery floorboards, teaching Thomas, just 4 years old, how to stay silent, how to move when no one was watching. But Jonathan Caldwell was always watching. And one cold February night, Elizabeth woke to find Thomas's bed empty. Elizabeth's scream never left her throat. The nursery was silent. Thomas's blankets lay folded neatly, his favorite wooden toy placed carefully on the pillow, as if someone wanted her to know he'd been taken, not lost. She searched the house, frantic and barefoot, her candle dripping wax across the cold wooden floors, but Jonathan was nowhere. The servants' quarters were empty, even the hounds were gone. Then she saw it, a faint draught beneath the rug in Jonathan's study. She lifted the heavy tapestry and found a trapdoor she'd never known existed. Rusted hinges groaned as she pried it open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. The air below was damp and thick, carrying a strange metallic tang. As she crept down, she heard muffled chanting, low, rhythmic, inhuman. At the bottom, a stone corridor stretched beneath Millhaven, lined with iron sconces that burned with a pale blue flame. Elizabeth followed the sound until it opened into a vast underground chamber carved into the bedrock. There, beneath a blackened wooden cross, stood Jonathan Caldwell. He held Thomas in his arms. Around him, 7 hooded figures knelt in a circle etched with symbols older than scripture. Jonathan turned, his eyes shining with fevered devotion, and whispered, "The covenant begins tonight." Elizabeth stepped into the chamber, her breath ragged, her bare feet scraping against the cold stone. Jonathan didn't flinch. He held Thomas tighter, cradling him as though the boy were both sacrifice and salvation. The hooded figures turned their heads, their faces lost in shadow, their chanting slowing to a hum that seemed to vibrate through the marrow of her bones. "Give him to me," she whispered, her voice trembling but sharp. Jonathan smiled. It was not a husband's smile. It was the smile of a man who had surrendered himself to something far older than reason. "You don't understand, Elizabeth," he said softly. "We are chosen. Our blood was bound to this land before it was ever Virginia. Before the first stones of Millhaven were laid, the covenant was sealed." She stared at him, shaking her head, but he kept speaking, his words rising, trembling, desperate. "Every Caldwell carries it, the mark, the memory. We are the keepers, Elizabeth. Through Thomas, the circle completes. If we fail, the gift dies. And so do we." Elizabeth's stomach turned cold. This wasn't just madness. This was legacy. She glanced at the hooded figures, noticing for the first time the gold rings glinting on their fingers. Insignias she recognized from Jonathan's secret ledger. Judges, clergymen, men who wrote laws, not followed them. This wasn't Jonathan's delusion, it was their design. And tonight they meant to finish what had begun centuries ago. Elizabeth lunged forward before fear could root her in place. "Let him go!" Her scream cut through the chamber, shattering the rhythmic hum of the hooded figures. Jonathan's smile faded. Slowly, deliberately, he placed Thomas on the stone altar at the center of the circle. The boy whimpered, reaching for her, but the robed men pressed closer, their shadows stretching like claws across the floor. Jonathan raised a ceremonial dagger, its blade carved with strange spiral markings that seemed to move when the firelight touched them. "It must be done," he whispered. "Through Thomas, the covenant renews. Without him, we are nothing." Elizabeth didn't think. She moved. She hurled herself into the circle, knocking one of the hooded figures aside. The dagger clattered against the stone, ringing like a bell in the silence. Jonathan roared, his face twisting into something unrecognizable. "Do you understand what you've done?" She grabbed Thomas, clutching him against her chest, and backed toward the archway. But as she did, one of the robed men stepped forward, pulling back his hood. It was Reverend Coleridge, the man who baptized Thomas, the man who dined at their table every Sunday. His voice was cold, almost pitying. "You can't run from this, Elizabeth. The blood chooses. Always." Behind him, the symbols on the stone floor began to glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, from deep beneath the earth, something answered. The chamber shook. A low, guttural resonance filled the stone corridors beneath Mill Haven. Elizabeth clutched Thomas to her chest, feeling his small heartbeat against her own, each pulse a fragile tether to reality. The glowing symbols on the floor writhed like living veins, and Jonathan Caldwell stepped forward, his eyes blazing with the fevered certainty of a man who believed himself immortal through blood. "This is not just inheritance, Elizabeth. It is eternity. Through him, through us, the covenant lives on. You cannot undo what has been willed by generations." Elizabeth's mind raced. Every lesson, every whispered justification from her youth, the tales of patriarchs, of divine blood, of sacrifice, had prepared her for obedience. But now, the full horror was clear. The covenant was a system of control, older than Mill Haven, older than Virginia itself, a machinery designed to bind the powerful to themselves, to ensure the elite's secrets persisted through fear, blood, and silence. She could feel it, the pull of the legacy, the seduction of power, the promise of immortality, all woven into the very stones beneath her feet. Then, with a force born of desperation, she shattered the circle. Candles toppled, symbols cracked, and the robed figures screamed as the glow of the sigils extinguished. Jonathan lunged, but Elizabeth leapt, dragging Thomas into the spiraling staircase, leaving centuries of secrecy and corruption behind in ruins. Outside, the winter wind tore through Mill Haven. She didn't look back. The Caldwell covenant had been broken, for now. And yet, some secrets never die. The question lingers. When you hear whispers of bloodlines and hidden empires, how far would you go to preserve your own legacy? Type in the comments, "I am the keeper," twice. Let it lock in your identity as one who sees beyond the veil. Only then do you step into the truth most men will never confront.